Hello, Encyclopedia Brown fans. I'm going to be reading his book, Encyclopedia Brown Shows the Way, by Donald J. Sobel. Chapter 1 is The Case of the Growling Dog. Crime was increasing everywhere in the United States, except in Idaville. No one, child or grown-up, got away with breaking the law in Idaville. Apart from catching crooks lickety-quick, Idaville was like most seaside towns its size. It had rich families and poor families, lovely beaches, 3 movie theaters, and 2 delicatessens. It had churches, a synagogue, and a little league. And it had 10-year-old Encyclopedia Brown, America's Sherlock Holmes in sneakers. Encyclopedia's father was chief of police. People across the country thought he was the smartest police chief on earth. Chief Brown was smart. His officers were brave. But once in a while, they came up against a crime they could not solve. Then Chief Brown knew what to do. He went home. Over dinner, he told Encyclopedia about the case. If Encyclopedia didn't solve the mystery before he finished his first glass of milk, his mother was disappointed. He was an only child. Chief Brown would have liked to see a statue of Encyclopedia placed outside the FBI building. He hated keeping his son's detective work a secret. But what good would it do to tell? Who would believe that the mastermind behind Idaville's wonderful police record could live happily on bubblegum and popcorn? So Chief Brown said nothing. Encyclopedia never breathed a word about the help he gave his father. He didn't want to seem different from other 5th graders, but he was stuck with his nickname. Only his parents and his teachers called him by his real name, Leroy. Everyone else called him Encyclopedia. An encyclopedia is a book or set of books filled with facts from A to Z. So was Encyclopedia Brown's head. He was really more like an entire library, only better. His pals could ask him questions without having to whisper. One evening over soup, Chief Brown said, "I think I know who stole Mr. Dale's electric drill last night." "Who?" asked Mrs. Brown. "Ed Baker," answered Chief Brown. "Isn't he the teenager who stole a car in January and wrecked it over in Glen City?" asked Encyclopedia. Chief Brown nodded. Ed was seen running near Mr. Dale's house last night, around the time someone broke into the garage and stole the electric drill and some other tools. "Did you arrest him, dear?" asked Mrs. Brown. "I can't prove he did it," said Chief Brown. "Ed claims he was running to get in shape for football. He says he ran by Mr. Dale's house, but didn't stop." "Don't you have any clues?" asked Encyclopedia. "2, replied Chief Brown. "We found one perfect footprint in the backyard, a left sneaker print. It was made in a spot of soft earth." "Does it match Ed's sneaker?" asked Mrs. Brown. "It's a half size too small," said Chief Brown heavily. "Perhaps Mr. Dale made the print himself," suggested Mrs. Brown. "Mr. Dale insists that no one has been in the backyard for nearly a week," said Chief Brown. "The rain yesterday afternoon washed out all the old footprints." "So the sneaker print is new," said Encyclopedia. "It has to be the thief's. What's the second clue, Dad?" "A piece of a shirt," said Chief Brown. "It got caught on a branch 6 inches above the ground." "Did you find a torn shirt at Ed's house?" inquired Mrs. Brown. "No," said Chief Brown. "Ed probably didn't realize he'd left a footprint, but he would have discovered the rip and thrown the shirt away." Chief Brown took a spoonful of soup. Then he continued. "Ed must have been crawling on his stomach in order not to be seen," he said. "What makes you think that?" asked Mrs. Brown. "Well, if Ed had been walking, the low branch would have ripped the bottom of his trousers, not his shirt," said Chief Brown. "But what he did next is the puzzler." "How come?" said Encyclopedia. "The low branch is outside the fence that goes around Mr. Dale's house and garage," said Chief Brown. "At night, a big German shepherd named Rover runs loose inside the fence." Said Encyclopedia. "Ed crawled to the fence so as not to be seen and climbed over, but the question is, how did he get past Rover?" "Is Rover such a good watchdog?" asked Mrs. Brown. "Rover is an attack dog," said Chief Brown. "He's trained to bark at strangers and to seize their sleeves or trousers in his teeth." "Ed could have fed him something to keep him quiet," said Mrs. Brown. "Rover won't take food from anyone except Mr. Dale," replied Chief Brown. "Didn't Mr. Dale hear anything at all last night?" asked Encyclopedia. "He heard Rover growling," said Chief Brown. "Since Rover is trained to bark at strangers, Mr. Dale thought the dog was chasing a frog or a rabbit. He didn't even get out of bed to look." "Perhaps Ed clubbed Rover and knocked him out," offered Mrs. Brown. Rover wasn't hurt, said Chief Brown. Well, not in the usual way. What do you mean, Dad? Inquired Encyclopedia. This morning, Mr. Dale found Rover curled up by the back door whimpering, said Chief Brown. The poor dog's been that way ever since. He won't eat. It's as if he had a nervous breakdown last night. My word, exclaimed Mrs. Brown. She looked at Encyclopedia for help. The boy detective had already closed his eyes. He always closed his eyes when he did his deepest thinking on a case. Suddenly he opened them. Ed made the footprint. He stole Mr. Dale's tools. But the footprint is too small, protested Mrs. Brown. The footprint was made when the earth was still wet from the rain, said Encyclopedia. It's been hot and dry since. Of course, cried Chief Brown. How stupid of me. When earth dries, it shrinks, so the footprint is smaller than when it was made. Oh, Leroy, said Mrs. Brown proudly. Then she gave a troubled frown. But how did Ed get past Rover? The clue of the torn shirt tells us how, Mom, answered Encyclopedia. How? Here's a picture of Rover. And you can see he's looking up at a boy who's just peeking over the fence. Now, some of you might have already figured out what it could have been that Ed did. Maybe something to do with clothes? Let's read the solution. Solution to the case of the growling dog. Rover, an attack dog, was trained to hold strangers by the clothing. But what if Rover had nothing to hold? The poor dog could not do what he'd been trained to do, so he would have a fit and break down. That, Encyclopedia realized, is what had happened. Ed had caught his shirt on the low branch, but not while he was crawling. The shirt was dangling from his hand, for Ed was carrying his shirt and all his clothing. He left his clothing outside the fenced yard. Then he climbed the fence and walked past the confused Rover, naked. Found out Ed confessed to stealing Mr. Dale's tools. And Rover recovered after a time. Case closed.